How to write a scientific essay. By the end of this podcast, you will understand some basic rules for scientific writing, how to structure an essay, and where to find more information on how to reference appropriately. First of all, let's look at some basic rules for scientific writing. When writing for a scientific audience, it's extremely important to be succinct, so don't use 10 words when 5 will do. Bear in mind the audience you are writing for and make sure your writing style is appropriate. Use complete sentences, not shorthand notes. Be clear and concise, and make sure you use precise words and correct terminology. Avoid being highfalutin. That means avoid using fancy words that no one knows what they mean. Equally, avoid being too colloquial. Phrases like a lot of and really interesting are too casual and don't belong in a piece of scientific writing. It's also important to avoid hyperbole such as this amazing study or this proves X, which is fantastic. And avoid abbreviations like don't and can't. Instead, use the full terms, so do not and cannot. Make sure you define technical terms that are not commonly used, and always define acronyms upon first use. The only exception to this is common acronyms like DNA and RNA, which do not necessarily need defining. It's also important to italicize the Latin names of living things, as well as phrases like in vitro, in vivo, ex vivo, and so on, and always write in the past tense. It's generally recommended to write in the third person, so avoid using I and we. However, that said, there is some movement towards this in some areas of scientific writing, and so it is best to follow the convention of a particular journal, remaining appropriate to the intended audience. For the purposes of university coursework, I'd recommend writing in the third person. Use active verbs rather than passive ones. So for example, an active voice would say drug X was added to the cells, as opposed to the passive voice which would say the cells were treated with drug X. Next, let's look at how to structure an essay. You'll have heard it said before, an essay needs a beginning, a middle and an end. I would add to that, where you have been asked to write in the style of a journal article or review, you must also include an abstract. In essence, in the introduction you tell the reader what you're going to tell them, then in the middle you tell them it, and then at the end you tell them again what you've just told them. So without being overly repetitive, you're being clear about the argument you have constructed and what you've found out. Start with a title, something short and punchy that describes the content of the essay accurately. And I actually recommend writing the abstract last, so we'll come back to this later. The introduction should cover the background to the topic or topics and should set the context for the main body of the essay. Why is it important to write about this? What are you trying to uncover? Who is affected? And so on. The reframing exercise, thinking about the what, who, when, where and why, will come in useful for thinking about what to include in the introduction. Make sure your introduction includes a brief sentence or two that outlines exactly what you've discovered and will present in the main body of the essay. The middle will be the largest section of the essay and will likely need to be split up into smaller chunks using appropriate subheadings. This part of the essay is where you will bring in your evidence to support your argument. Follow a logical progression using data or evidence to support each point until you reach a logical conclusion. This logical conclusion must not be vague. For example, this treatment appeared to have an effect. There either was an effect or there wasn't. Be specific. Make sure you briefly describe the key results from the evidence you cite in 1 or 2 sentences, highlighting how or why this supports your argument. That said, there's also no need to quote specific statistical values like means or p-values in a review or essay. You also don't need to describe the details of the experiment in full, only those that are relevant to your argument. Where you are critically analysing another author's work, it is better to try and think of an alternative hypothesis that can explain the observed data in a different way rather than just disparaging their work. This is one of the most creative aspects of scientific research and is a key skill that you must develop. Where you are including figures in your work, make sure they have a title and a figure legend, and also make sure you refer to them in the main body of the essay. Don't just plonk a picture in for the sake of it. So once you've included all the information you wish to include to support your argument, you then need to summarise all your points in a conclusion. Be precise and succinct. Don't use vague phrases like "it would appear that," but instead say "Jones et al. In brackets 2012 claimed," if you don't agree, or "showed," if you do agree, or "suggested," if it's a hypothesis, that XYZ. Using your vocabulary in this way can make it clear to the reader what your opinion is, but without overtly stating that "I think that," whatever. The conclusion should leave the reader in no doubt what points you have put across and what your overall argument is about. You will also want to include in this section some unanswered questions that need further work to investigate. Sometimes you'll see this under a subheading called Future Work or Future Perspectives. You can choose how you wish to do this. Okay, so now we've attacked the essay as a whole, let's return to the abstract, which, as you'll remember, I recommended writing last. The reason for this is that when you set out to write your essay, you won't necessarily have thought about all your arguments or the main thread of the body of work. By waiting until after you've written the whole essay, you will have a better idea of what to include in the abstract. The abstract is a little like the first paragraph in a newspaper article. It gives a brief overview of what's inside the full article, but without having to trawl through the whole thing. Think of it as a teaser to entice the reader in. You want to include a sentence or two about the topic and why it's important, and then your main argument or arguments, what you've discovered, and the significance of this. The final thing to consider is referencing your sources throughout your work. There are plenty of excellent guides on the DMU Library website which tell you how to reference correctly in the style you are required to use. I would like you to use the Harvard referencing style. As you make a point in the body of the essay, which incidentally could be in the introduction, the middle or the conclusion, but never the abstract, you will cite the relevant author in the text using the name and the date. So for example, you would say, "Studies have shown that," in brackets, "Jones et al. 2012, close brackets." And then at the end of the essay, you will include a list of references, and this is called a bibliography, where you write the reference out in full. Where there are only two authors, you would write both names in the citation in the text. So for example, Hanahan and Weinberg, 2011. You only actually use et al. Where there are 3 or more authors. To make life easier for yourself, consider using a reference manager software to create your bibliography. It's much easier and quicker than typing it all out manually yourself. DMU subscribes to RefWorks, and there is plenty of guidance on the library website showing you how to use it effectively. So there we have it, some tips on how to write appropriately for a scientific audience, some basic rules for structuring an essay or article, and some help with referencing your sources. Remember, make an argument and state this in your introduction. Build your argument and use the rest of the essay to convince the reader that your argument is sensible, logical, and conforms to the facts. And finally, reach a logical conclusion. This is the most important point to finish the reader's journey with you. For more information, please refer to the sources cited in the comments below.